Hello everyone, good day to all of you. I will be discussing about the maintenance and shift in language. Again, I'm Menchit Sevilla. First, we are going to discuss the shift first before we discuss about the maintenance in language. But before that, let me tell you our objectives for this discussion. We actually have three. First, we are going to explore the various constraints on language choice faced by different communities. I will be introducing three types of communities later. Second, we are also going to explore the potential longer term effects of these choices. There are only two possible longer term effects, that is only language shift or language death. And third, lastly, we are going to describe the attempts to reverse these consequences through language revival efforts. So there's still hope for a language. Okay, so language shift in different communities. We have three. First, we have the migrant minorities. Second, we have the non-migrant communities. And third, we have migrant majorities. So first, migrant minorities. These are speakers who speak, or use the language in another area. So from the word migrant, these are speakers who move from one place to another country. Second, we have non-migrant communities. These are speakers who stay in their own homeland, but language shift could still happen. Third, we have migrant majorities. These are speakers who move from one area to another since they are migrant, but they speak, or use the international language. Okay, first let's talk about migrant minorities. So I have here an example. Please listen carefully as I read to you. We have Maniben. Maniben is a young British Hindu woman who lives in Coventry. Her family moved to Britain from Uganda in 1970 when she was still 5 years old. She started work on the shop floor in a bicycle factory when she was 16 years old already. At home, Maniben speaks Gujarati, so it's a Hindu language, with her parents and grandparents. Although she had learned English at school, she found she didn't need much at work because many of the girls working with her also spoke Gujarati, the Hindu language. So when it wasn't too noisy, they would talk to each other in their home language. Maniben was good at her job, and she got promoted to floor supervisor. In that job, she needed to use English more of the time, though she could still use some Gujarati with her old workmates. She went to evening classes and learned to type. Then, because she was interested, she went on to learn how to use a computer. And now, she works in the main office and she uses English almost all the time at work. Now, what can we conclude from that example? Again, we're talking about language shift. Maniben is an example of a member of a migrant minority. We can deduce that Maniben's pattern of language use at work has gradually shifted over a period of 10 years. So it took 10 years for Maniben to process language shift. And that is from Gujarati to English. Migrant families provide an obvious example of this process of language shift. So when language shift happens, the major role player are usually migrant families, those speakers that move from one country to another, bringing their own minor language. So in countries like England, Australia, New Zealand, and the USA, the school is one of the first domains in which children of migrant families meet English. But for many children of migrants, English soon then becomes the normal language for talking to other children, including their brothers and sisters. And then children discuss school and friends in English with each other. And gradually, their parents begin to use English to them too, especially if they are working in jobs where they use English. So that's how language shift happens in this kind of community, the migrant minorities. Okay, let's talk about the second community, which is the non-migrant communities. Let me give you an example. Please listen carefully. Armin, we have Armin. Armin is an Iranian teacher of English. So, a teacher of English like us. So I'm pretty sure you can relate to this one. He is concerned that Farsi is actually the official language of Iran. Farsi is displacing his native language, Azeri. Okay? One piece of evidence supporting his concern about his native language, Azeri, is that the streets of his hometown in Tabriz are full of signs in the Farsi language, not in Azeri language, which is his ethnic language. What is more is that people are not taught to read and write in Azeri, despite the fact that there is a rich literature in the language. Some of it housed in books in the Tabriz library. So there is a vicious circle. People don't use Azeri in public signs because they know that literacy in Azeri is almost non-existent. Now, what can we conclude from that example? So again, that Armin is an example of a member of non-migrant communities. So Armin does not have to move from one country to another, bringing or speaking and using his minority language. Okay, how did language shift happen? Okay, language shift is not always the result of migration. You do not need to migrate for you to experience language shift. It also happens in these communities, the non-migrant communities. So the long-term prognosis or prediction or expectation of this one is that it will not good for Azeri, which is the ethnic language of Sir Armin, unless some assertive action is taken to maintain it. Okay, if that ethnic language Azeri is not being maintained, then there is a possibility of a great language shift. Again, we're still in non-migrant communities. Let me give you other examples. Example, we have the Hungarian language. The Hungarian language is deemed to be the low language, but it is the language of solidarity for people who speak Hungarian. How did language shift happen? Language shift happened from the Hungarian language to German language. Okay, that's the language shift that happened in Oberwart. Okay, and now you can only hear Hungarian language rarely on prayers in church. So that's how language shift happened. Okay, let's talk about the third and the last type of community, which is migrant majorities. Okay, how the language shift happened in this community. So the influence of political and economic factors plays a great role for the language shift in this community. Example, we have England and English. Okay, so over the last couple of centuries, many speakers of Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Welsh, for instance, they have shifted to England. Okay, they moved to England, and consequently, they learned English, primarily in order to get work. So if you go to England, if you're an Irish or Welsh people who went to England, they need to learn English for them to get work. And that is an example of an economic factor. Okay, let's talk about colonization. When colonial powers invade other countries, their languages often become dominant. So, example of these colonizers, we have countries such as Portugal, Spain, France, and Britain have generally imposed their languages along with their rule. Now, what will happen to minority groups if the major language is being brought to them? So, they will find themselves under increasing pressure to adopt the language. So, that is very sad, actually. So, we're still in migrant majorities, the third type of community where language shift happens. Another example is we have in New Zealand. The language shift happened from Maori to English language. The Maori language only have few fluent speakers. That's why. So let's talk back about colonial rule. If there's a colonial rule, then there's a possibility of a lost language, especially of the ethnic languages, which over 4 or 5 generations, which only last for these generations. So the longer the colonizer stays in place in your area, the more languages will be lost. So, yeah. Next, language shift. Language shift always happens toward the language of the dominant group. Okay? It is rarely impossible for language shift to happen from the dominant to the ethnic language. So, but we don't know. Who knows, diba? I might share also other examples like that later. Now, what will happen to the minority group again? They will abandon their own language, which is very sad, actually. Okay, we're done with the three communities. Again, first we have migrant minorities, second we have non-migrant communities, and third we have migrant majorities. Language shift happens in those types of communities. Now let's talk about language death and language loss. This is kind of negative for me, and this is kind of sad as well. So let me give you an example. We have the language Ayapaneco. Ayapaneco is actually Mexico's indigenous language. But unfortunately, there are only 2 fluent speakers left. And these 2 fluent speakers are aged 75 years old and 69 years old. And you know what's worse? They refuse to talk to each other, which is very weird. We don't know. It could be part of their culture. Okay, the disappearance of the language Ayapaneco is known to have the factor of increasing urbanization. Okay? The reasons for the disappearance of Ayapaneco can more accurately be linked to factors such as increasing urbanization of the population and the political decision to introduce compulsory education in Spanish, aside from Ayapaneco. Okay, wait. Okay. Let's talk about language death. It is said that when a speaker dies, so is the language. That is very sad, actually. And the language will only survive if it is being passed on, especially to younger generations. Now, how did shift happen? Okay, when it comes to shift, language will shift, or if there is no threat, language will continue to thrive, and shift can be resisted. Okay, so there's also this, the predicted extinction is unfulfilled. Example of this is that it was predicted that almost all Australian Aboriginal languages would be extinct by the year 2000. A prediction in which fortunately has not been completely fulfilled, because up until now, a lot of Australian Aboriginal languages is being used. Okay, death does not mean it's not always direct. We have gradual death, that is the similar process to shift. So when a language dies gradually, not directly, as opposed to if all the speakers are being wiped out by a massacre or an epidemic, that is direct death. But if not, it dies gradually, and it undergoes a process similar to that of language shift before it dies. Okay. So, as the domains in which speakers use the language shrink, the speakers of the dying language become gradually less proficient in it. Have you ever experienced that, where you become less proficient in a language? So, you gotta be careful of that one as well. Let's talk about the loss. Language loss happens if there is little to no fluency of the language at all. Okay? And it is different from traditional language already. Example, we have Cebuano. I think for me, the traditional Cebuano is being used and spoken in the Bible. If you read the Bible, the Cebuano is very traditional, but the one we speak right now is not really that traditional. So, that's it. Okay, we're done with language death and language loss. I don't really want to talk about that one because it's very sad and negative. Let's study about the language shift factors. These are the following factors where language shift happens. It could be because of economic, social, political. We also have demographic factors. And lastly, we have attitudes and values. Let's talk about economic, social, and political factors. These three are just actually connected with each other because they are just interrelated. Okay, so for you to learn the second language, you need to have an important reason for learning the second language. What do you think is it? What's the main or basic reason? Why do we need to know and learn English? Why do we need to speak English? And I think the basic reason is to obtain work. Diba? Most interviews at work is in English. When you were interviewed at work, was it in English? So it's like that. Obtaining work is the most obvious economic reason for learning another language. And then that will then result to bilingualism. Okay, so you have here a picture of different races in a work. How can you avoid language shift? So this is one solution. You need to take active steps to maintain your ethnic language. Okay. So let's take note that the language shift is unavoidable unless it is prevented. So at first, it appears very important to learn the majority language. For us, it is English in order to achieve social and economic success. But without conscious maintenance of our ethnic language, it can and usually does disappear in as few as 3 generations. But I don't think we need to fear a language shift because Cebuano or Bisaya is being spoken in Visayas and Mindanao, and Filipino is mainly spoken in Luzon. So we're done with the economic, social, political factors. Basically, it's about getting a job. That's why you need to know the second language. Let's talk more about demographic factors, the demography. We have here resistance to language shift tends to last longer in rural than in urban areas. Okay, this is partly because rural groups tend to be isolated from centers of political power for longer. Okay, so example is, since I am working at Lingayen National High School, they have the tribe, their Talaandig, so they have the Talaandig ethnic tribe, and then they also speak the Talaandig. So in the book, they have example, we have Ukrainians in Canada. They live out of town on farms, those people who live on farms. They maintain their ethnic language better than those in the towns. Okay, so they can meet most of their social needs in the ethnic or minority language. So who else would you speak to if you are in a rural area? It's only the people around you who speak the ethnic or minority language. Another example, we have Maori in New Zealand, wherein there are older native speakers who still use the language to talk to each other in their homes, in the streets, as well as for formal Maori speech events. So that is one demographic factor, the rural groups. Another is the size of the group is sometimes a critical factor. Example, we have the Spanish language. Spanish language in the USA have survived well due partly to the large number of speakers. Now, when it comes to language maintenance, to maintain a language, you must have people you can use it with on a regular basis. So it would be difficult to maintain a language. Maintaining a language is near impossible if there are only few opportunities to use the mother tongue. So, do you think it's normal? Let's talk about multilingualism. Okay. Unless multilingualism is normal in a community, one language tends to predominate in the home. So no matter how many languages you know or speak everywhere, when you get home, when you go back at home, there will only be one language that tends to predominate. Okay, we're done with demographic factors of rural areas, size of the group. Let's talk about strong patriarchal groups. This one actually interested me under demographic factors. Why? Because it needs the father's support for the use of the minority language in the home. Then it proves effective if there's father's support. Example of these are Italian and Samoan fathers. Okay, they actively encourage the use of their languages at home. But that's when the kids are still at a young age and does not start school. But when the kids start school already, then it takes a very determined parent to maintain minority language at home, especially if the other parent doesn't speak the minority language well. Okay, so we're done with demographic factors of rural areas, size of the group, patriarchal groups. Let's go to another factor. We're done with demographic factors. Let's proceed to attitudes and values. This is also a factor in a language shift. If the language is seen as an important symbol of ethnic identity, then it will be most likely maintained. Example, we have the language French. So maintaining French in Canada and the USA is easier because French is a language with international status. Okay, it has international prestige. So French is actually a good language to know. If you know French, then pretty sure you are seen as one of the highly intellectuals. That's what we always stereotype about it. If you know that bonjour something. Okay. So, languages with international prestige, example, we have Spanish. The language Spanish resists the language shift rather than Maori or Dirbal. It's actually the ethnic language who is prone to language shift, especially if the language does not have an international status or prestige. Let's talk about pride. So the pride in their ethnic identity and their language can be important factors which contribute to language maintenance. These are provided. Okay, so if the speakers of the language seem to have their language symbol as a symbol of their ethnic identity, then that is one of the factors wherein language could be maintained. Okay, there's a question. How can a minority language be maintained? So again, if language is symbol of a minority's identity, then it can be maintained longer. Example of these are Greek migrants. Greek migrants in Australia, New Zealand, and the USA. Okay, other examples, we have members of the Greek community are actually great examples of language maintenance, the Greek language. Okay, other examples are built communities. Example of these are Indian and Pakistani in Britain, wherein Punjabi or Gujarati are spoken in shops. What else? What else are examples of built communities? So in the USA, Chinese people who live in the Chinatown. Chinatown is an example of a built communities. Areas of big cities are much more likely to maintain a Chinese dialect as their mother tongue through to the third generation than those who move outside the Chinatown area. Okay. Uh, Other answer for that question, how can a minority language be maintained? We're talking about minority languages here. Could be through new migrants or visitors. But how? Okay. Another factor which may contribute to language maintenance for those who emigrate is the degree and frequency of contact with the homeland. So, a regular stream of new migrants or even visitors will keep the need for using the language alive. So, of course, when you go back to your homeland, when you keep visiting your homeland for a vacation or whatever, you need to use their ethnic language. Okay, I have here, I made a table because it's kind of long in the book, so I made a table for it to be understood easier. So example, we have Polynesian migrants from these islands, New, Tokelau, Tonga, and Samoa. So their homeland is New Zealand. So Polynesian migrants from these islands arrived in New Zealand regularly. So New Zealand Polynesians, what will they do if they see a kabaro or whatever? Of course, they are going to provide them with hospitality. What are expected of these migrants? The new arrivals are expected to provide new linguistic input for the New Zealand communities. What else? Okay, the prospect of regular trips back home provides a similar motivation to maintain fluency for many groups. So we have Samoan men in New Zealand, for instance. Of course, their homeland is the Samoan Islands. They are often expected to return home to take up family and community responsibilities at a later stage in their lives when they grew up enough. Lastly, we have the last example, the Greek New Zealanders. Greek migrants also see a trip back to Greece as a high priority for themselves and their children. Most Greek New Zealanders, they regard a trip back to Greece as essential at some point in their lives. And many young Greek girls take the trip with the express aim of securing a good Greek husband. So clearly, this provides a very strong incentive to maintain proficiency in Greek language. Okay, what else? This is another answer for the question a while ago, which is how can a minority language be maintained? You have to take active steps to protect the language, of course. But how? It is clear that social factors may help resist the influence of economic pressures. Example of these are extended families. There is a good reason to continue using the minority language at home, especially if there are a lot of people at home. Okay, other example are groups which discourage intermarriage, such as the Greek and the Chinese communities. They actually contribute a lot to language maintenance in that way. But you must take note that marriage to a majority group member, that is also the quickest way of ensuring shift to the majority group language. Especially it affects the children much more. Okay, because if the children has parents who speak different language, he or she will be in the middle and needs to decide what language to speak on. So obviously a group who manage to ensure their language is used in settings such as school or their place of worship. Okay, it always starts with the children in school and also in the place of worship. That will increase the chances of language maintenance. So let me give you more examples. We have Tongan people in New Zealand who attends church services in Tongan. Okay. Other examples are heritage language programs in Canada. They use minority language in school to maintain languages of Canadian Ukrainians and Canadian Germans. What else? Bilingual education in Wales. This is available throughout the education system in many areas. But continued influx of English speakers to Wales means that Welsh will never be safe. Okay. What else? Another answer for that question, how can a minority language be maintained, is through international supports. What are these institutional supports? What are these institutional supports? This could be education, law and administration, which is the highest there in the graph, and religion and media. I think for me the most important is law and administration, and that is the government. When the government of a country is committed to maintaining or reviving a language, it is then possible to legislate for its use in all these domains. So if the government tells us to use this language, to maintain this language, to revive this language, then it will then be used as well for education. That language will also be used as well for religion and media. So examples of this, the one who followed this type of institutional support is Hebrew in Israel. We also have Welsh in Wales. They made it as a compulsory subject. Okay. Let's talk about ethno-linguistic vitality. We're done with answering the question, how can a minority language be maintained? Ethno-linguistic vitality. Okay. When it comes to ethno-linguistic vitality, let's take a look at the social psychologist. Many of the factors that I discussed as relevant to language maintenance have been integrated by Howard and his colleagues using the concept of ethno-linguistic vitality. These social psychologists, they suggest that we can predict the likelihood that a language will be maintained by measuring its ethno-linguistic vitality. There are actually 3 components that are involved. So I made an acronym for it as SSS so that it will be easy to remember. Firstly, the status of the language as indicated by attitudes and values towards it. So if the speakers of that language tend to make the language as their ethnic symbol, then it would most likely to be maintained. Second S is the size. The size of the group who uses the language and their distribution. So, are the speakers of that language concentrated in one area, or are they scattered in different areas? That can also be measured. And lastly is the support. The extent to which the language enjoys institutional support, which I just recently discussed. The concept of ethno-linguistic vitality is clearly very useful in studying language maintenance and shift. It also provides some ideas for those interested in slowing down or reversing language shifts. So, we don't know, in the future, you might want to make a study about an ethnic language. If you are interested in slowing down or reversing language shift, you can actually use this ethno-linguistic vitality in your research paper. You just need to research more about it. Okay. Let's examine linguistic landscape. What are linguistic landscapes? Examining linguistic landscapes means looking at public texts. So examples are public texts in their physical and social context. So this linguistic landscape can be a rich source of information about the social-linguistic complexities of a community. Excuse me. So I'm pretty sure you can see a lot of public texts around you. What language are they using? The evidence of the vitality of a minority linguistic group may consist, these are examples of public texts or linguistic landscape, consists of restaurant signs, shop signs, church signs, and advertisements in the minority language. So these public signs can be interpreted in many different ways. They could indicate a community where several languages have official status. They could also indicate that important information needs to be in several languages because the linguistic repertoire of some individuals may be restricted to just one of those languages. So, I don't know if you noticed some public signs around you which are translated or has to be translated, di ba? Next, it could also indicate that the sign writer wishes to convey an impression of sophistication. Okay, let's talk about language revival. Finally, this is the positive topic here in my report because it talks about hope. Okay, for a language to be revived, sometimes a community becomes aware that its language is in danger of disappearing and takes deliberate steps to revitalize it. So attempts have been made, especially in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, for example, to preserve their indigenous languages. And in New Zealand, steps are also being taken to attempt to reverse language shift. And when you reverse a language shift, that means in New Zealand, they revitalize the language Maori. So after revitalizing, it is then being preserved. It is sometimes argued that the success of such efforts will depend on how far language loss has occurred. That there is sometimes a point of no return. Okay, let's talk about Welsh. Welsh is also interesting. Welsh is a flourishing language in the 19th century. It has survived well as the L language. What do you mean by L language? I researched it. It means low language. So, in a diglossia situation where the ruling elite used English for administration. Okay, these are some famous and historical Welsh people. So, if you know one, you can tell me later. It has taken a conscious and concerted effort on the part of many Welsh people to slow down the process of language loss. So this has included obtaining a Welsh language television channel, wow, and establishing successful bilingual education. They actually take a great importance on bilingual education programs, which extend from preschool to tertiary level, even in college, in areas such as Gwynedd. So that's the Welsh language in Wales. In at least some areas, Welsh-English bilingualism has become a reality for children who are taught in Welsh at school. Now, ironically, it appears the success of these programs may be again under threat as a result of the economic situation of the English. So let me just review to you the language maintenance and shift factors. We talked about the following factors. We discussed economic, political, institutional, demographic, attitudinal, educational, and lastly, socio-cultural. So those are all my report. Thank you very much for listening. Do you have any questions? You can reach me here, or feel free to ask me questions as well after this. Thank you very much.